There are marriages built on love and marriages built on need, and marriages built on the particular cold arithmetic of power. The calculation that sets aside what a person wants and asks only what a situation requires. The marriage of Napoleon Bonaparte and Marie-Louise of Austria was the third kind. Both parties understood this. Neither pretended otherwise, at least not in private. And the story of what grew between them in the space where love was not. The strange, constrained, politically manufactured intimacy of two people who had been given to each other by the logic of empire is one of the most quietly devastating chapters of the Napoleonic era. It began with a divorce. Napoleon had loved Josephine de Beauharnais with a consuming asymmetric intensity that defined the emotional landscape of his private life for more than a decade. He had written to her from the battlefields of Italy in letters that bordered on fever. He had endured the knowledge that her feelings for him were warmer than indifferent but cooler than consuming. He had built an empire and placed a crown on her head and continued, through all of it, to need her in a way that the empire and the crown could not satisfy. And then, in December 1809, he had divorced her. The decision was political in its logic and human in its cost. Napoleon needed an heir. The succession of the empire required a son, and Josephine had not provided one, and the years that remained in which she might provide one were, by any realistic medical assessment, essentially over. The dynasty he had built required continuity that he could not produce with the woman he had. The calculation was clear. The outcome was necessary. He wept at the divorce ceremony, and she wept, and the thing was done. He was 40 years old. He had been in love, in his particular consuming way, with one woman for 13 years. He now needed to replace her with someone capable of producing an heir, and the replacement had to be chosen not for anything she was but for what her family and her bloodline represented to the European order he was trying to consolidate. Several candidates were considered. A Russian Grand Duchess was discussed. An alliance with Russia through marriage would have cemented the Tilsit relationship in a way that had strategic appeal. The Russian option eventually fell through, for reasons that involved the Tsar's hesitation and the diplomatic complexities of the moment. The Austrian option then emerged as both available and strategically superior. A Habsburg princess, daughter of the Emperor of Austria, would connect Napoleon's dynasty to the oldest and most legitimate imperial bloodline in European history. The bastard from Corsica, the outsider who had stormed the gates of European civilization by force, would be joined by marriage to the family that had embodied that civilization for centuries. The bride selected was Marie-Louise, Archduchess of Austria, daughter of Emperor Francis I. She was 18 years old. She had been raised in the Habsburg court with the comprehensive formation that such courts provided. Languages, music, painting, the arts of formal social presentation, the particular kind of composure that is required of people who represent institutions rather than merely themselves. She was, by the accounts of those who observed her, a pleasant young woman. Intelligent without being intellectually exceptional, disciplined without being cold, capable of warmth in her personal relationships while maintaining the necessary distance in public ones. She had been raised, in the years of the Napoleonic Wars, to understand Napoleon Bonaparte as the enemy of everything her family and her civilization represented. The France he led had defeated Austria twice, had humiliated her father, had redrawn the map of Europe in ways that reduced Habsburg power and Habsburg territory and Habsburg standing. She had grown up in a world in which Napoleon was the threat, the disruption, the man whose ambition was the source of the suffering her family had endured, and now she was being sent to Paris to marry him. She went. There was no meaningful alternative. The decision had been made by her father and his advisors on the basis of calculations that had nothing to do with what Marie-Louise wanted or felt or had been raised to believe. She was 20 years younger than Napoleon, had never met him, had every cultural and familial reason to regard him with hostility, and was being delivered to him as the solution to his dynastic problem. She understood all of this with a clarity that her youth did not diminish. She was a Habsburg princess. She knew what princesses were for. The first meeting between Napoleon and Marie-Louise took place in March 1810 before their official wedding, in a scene that has been described by those present with a range of tones. Some finding it touching, some finding it awkward, most finding it both simultaneously. Napoleon, unable to wait for the formal ceremony, went to meet her carriage on the road, entering it unannounced, presenting himself to his new wife without the protocols that would have surrounded their official introduction. He was impatient in the way that he was always impatient, and Marie-Louise found herself face to face with the man she had been given to in the confined space of a moving carriage without preparation. What she thought in those first moments she did not fully record. Her letters from the early period of the marriage are careful documents, affectionate in their language, reporting on her new circumstances with a dutiful warmth that tells something about her character and less about her feelings. She was not performing happiness in the theatrical sense. She was doing what she had been trained to do. managing a situation with the composure that the situation required, presenting the appropriate face to the appropriate audience, maintaining the distinction between what was felt and what was shown that aristocratic formation existed precisely to produce. Napoleon, for his part, was not subtle about his intentions or his satisfactions. He had received a young, healthy, politically perfect wife who was, by his own reported assessment, more biddable than Josephine and less personally demanding. He liked her. He treated her with consideration. He was, in the way of powerful men who have acquired what they needed and feel the ease of acquisition, kind to her. Attentive without being consuming, warm without the fever that had defined his feeling for Josephine. He also made clear, in the way that he made most things clear, that the primary purpose of the marriage was the heir it was supposed to produce, and that producing that heir was the frame within which everything else between them existed. Marie-Louise became pregnant within months of the marriage. The pregnancy proceeded without significant complication. On March 20th, 1811, she gave birth to a son, Napoleon François Joseph Charles Bonaparte, immediately given the title King of Rome, the heir that the empire required. The birth was attended with the elaborate ceremony appropriate to the arrival of an imperial heir, guns fired, officials notified, Europe informed that the succession had been secured. Napoleon was, by all accounts, genuinely moved by the birth of his son, not performed emotion. The accounts describe a man whose characteristic control was briefly and visibly overtaken by something more personal. He had wanted an heir for years. The desire was political in its origin, but had become, over time, something that went beyond the political. The particular human desire to produce a continuation of oneself, to see something of what one is carried forward into a future one will not be present to witness. The son arrived, and Napoleon held him, and the moment was one of the few in his public life in which what he appeared to feel and what he actually felt were fully aligned. Marie-Louise observed this, and her letters from the period suggest a woman who was genuinely moved by watching her husband's response to their child, whatever her more ambivalent feelings about the husband himself. She was a mother now, in addition to an empress, and the role of mother was one that she inhabited with what appears to have been genuine feeling, uncomplicated by the calculations and the performance that surrounded the other roles she occupied. But the marriage itself, the daily reality of being Napoleon Bonaparte's wife, of living in the palace with the man and his energy and his demands and his particular way of filling every room he entered, was more complex than the birth of a healthy son could resolve. Marie-Louise was not unhappy in the simple sense. She was not mistreated. Napoleon was not cruel to her, but the marriage existed in a permanent state of fundamental asymmetry that no amount of consideration on his part and composure on hers could fully dissolve. He needed something from her that he had already received. The heir was born, the succession was secured, the dynastic purpose of the marriage was accomplished. What remained was the ordinary life of two people who had been given to each other for reasons unrelated to what ordinary life requires. Affection, companionship, the particular quality of intimacy that grows between people who have chosen each other freely. They had not chosen each other. They had been assigned to each other by the logic of empire and the logic of dynasty and the necessity of Napoleon's situation in 1809. And the life they lived together was the life of two people aware, always, of that original condition, functioning within it with varying degrees of success and varying degrees of whatever feeling the situation allowed, but never able to entirely set it aside. Napoleon was absent for much of the marriage. The demands of empire kept him in the field, in negotiation, in the constant motion that defined his existence. Marie-Louise wrote to him during these absences. The letters are preserved, and they have been read by historians as evidence of a warmer attachment than the political origins of the marriage would suggest. She asked after his health. She reported on their son. She expressed the desire for his return in language that, if not the language of passionate love, was the language of genuine care. She had not, in the end, been able to maintain the complete emotional distance that the marriage's origins might have produced. She had come to care for him in the way that people who live closely with someone always come to care for them. Not the feeling she might have chosen, but real. Napoleon's feelings for Marie-Louise occupy a more complicated territory. He appreciated her. He was comfortable with her in ways he had not always been comfortable with Josephine. She was less demanding emotionally, less likely to require the kind of reassurance that Josephine's particular nature had required. She gave him the air that the empire needed and the relative domestic ease that his life's intensity required. He was not in love with her, in the way he had been in love with Josephine, but he was attached to her in the specific way that attachment forms between people who share a child and share a daily life and share the particular pressure of existing at the center of historical events. The marriage was never simple. It was never what either of them might have chosen in a world where choice had been available. It was the thing that necessity had made, and they inhabited it as well as such things can be inhabited. With dignity, with a performance of normalcy that occasionally became actual normalcy, with a child between them who was real in a way the marriage's foundations were not. When Napoleon's empire collapsed in 1814, Marie-Louise was separated from him in ways that went beyond the physical. The Allied powers, in the settlement that followed the abdication, took her back to Austria, back to her family, back to the court she had come from, back to the world from which she had been extracted 4 years earlier to serve as the solution to Napoleon's dynastic problem. She took their son with her. Napoleon went to Elba. They never saw each other again. The son Napoleon had wept at the birth of, the King of Rome, who became, in the Austrian court, Franz, Duke of Reichstadt, stripped of his French title and his French name, raised as an Austrian prince in deliberate distance from everything his father represented, died in Vienna in 1832 at the age of 21. He had tuberculosis. He had never returned to France. He had spent his short life as the inconvenient living reminder of a dynasty that the European order had decided to eliminate, raised by people who had defeated his father and who managed his existence with the careful neutrality of those who know that a symbol must be handled without being activated. Napoleon learned of his son's existence on St. Helena through the filtered news that reached the island. He did not see him again after the separation of 1814. He dictated, in his memoirs, instructions and advice for the son he could not reach. What to read, how to think, how to conduct himself as a leader. Whether any of this reached the boy in any meaningful form, whether the Duke of Reichstadt read his father's words and found in them anything more than the advice of a historical figure connected to him by accident of birth, cannot be determined with certainty. Marie-Louise remarried after Napoleon's death in 1821. She had, in the years following the separation, formed an attachment to an Austrian count, a relationship that the historical record treats with the delicacy appropriate to a complicated situation. She governed, under Austrian supervision, the Duchy of Parma that had been assigned to her in the Vienna settlement. She was not, in those years, unhappy. She had found in the quieter life that the collapse of the empire made possible, something that resembled the ordinary existence she had never been allowed while it was Napoleon's wife. She spoke of Napoleon in later years, with a measured respect that acknowledged his extraordinary qualities without the warmth that genuine love would have produced. She acknowledged that he had treated her well. She acknowledged that she had come to care for him. She did not claim that she had loved him in the full sense of the word, and she did not pretend that the marriage had been what either of them might have freely chosen. This honesty, the refusal to retrospectively sentimentalize an arrangement that had been at its foundation a political transaction, is perhaps the most revealing thing about Marie-Louise. She had understood what the marriage was from the beginning. She had inhabited it with composure and genuine effort. She had produced the heir that it required, and had come to feel, for the man she had been given to, something real if not everything. And when it was over, she returned to her own life with the same composure she had brought to the other life, without drama, without excessive grief, without the performance of a feeling she did not entirely have. Napoleon had needed Josephine. He had married Marie-Louise. And the distance between those two things, between what he had needed and what he had required, was the space in which the second marriage existed, a functional space, a dignified space. A space in which a child was born and raised for a few years before being taken away, and in which two people who had been assigned to each other managed, against the odds of their origins, to construct something that was not love, but was not nothing. It was perhaps the most honest relationship of Napoleon's life, because it had never pretended to be anything other than what it was. And what it was, beneath the imperial ceremony and the political calculation and the Habsburg bloodline and the son who was born and taken away. What it actually was, at its irreducible core, was two people making the best of a situation neither of them had chosen. That is not a love story, but it is a human one. And in the long accounting of Napoleon Bonaparte's extraordinary and consuming life, the human stories are the ones that last longest, because they are the ones that do not require the victories to make them real. There is a scene from the early months of the marriage, recorded in the memoirs of one of Marie-Louise's ladies-in-waiting, a woman who was present in the daily life of the palace and who wrote with the particular honesty of someone who had no political stake in the narrative she was preserving. That captures something about the marriage that the official portraits and the diplomatic correspondence do not. It was an evening in the late summer of 1810. Napoleon and Marie-Louise had been married for several months. Marie-Louise was already pregnant with the child who would become the King of Rome, though this was not yet publicly confirmed. The Emperor and Empress were in the private apartments of the Tuileries, and the lady-in-waiting was present at a discreet distance in the outer room, close enough to observe, not close enough to intrude. Napoleon was at his desk, working through dispatches. He always worked through dispatches in the evenings, the administrative burden of empire not pausing for anything. Marie-Louise was at the piano, playing quietly. It was not a performance. She was not playing for an audience. She was simply playing in the private way that people play when music is something they actually do rather than something they present. The music she played was a piece the lady-in-waiting did not recognize. Something European. Careful, not French. At some point, Napoleon put down the dispatch he was reading and listened. He did not turn toward the piano. He did not acknowledge that he had stopped working. He simply sat facing his desk and listened to his wife play in the next room. He stayed like this for several minutes. Then he picked up the next dispatch and continued working. The lady-in-waiting recorded this small scene without particular emphasis, as one detail among the many details of daily palace life. She did not interpret it. She did not suggest what it meant. She simply noted it, with the precision of someone accustomed to observing people whose private life was, to some extent, a historical document. What it meant cannot be determined with certainty, but it is possible to sit with the image for a moment and feel its weight. A man who had organized his entire emotional life around a woman who sometimes did not open his letters, who had divorced that woman because necessity required it, and because the empire required an heir, who had received a young Habsburg princess in her place, and was making, in his way, the best of the arrangement. That man, at his desk in the evening, listening to his wife play piano in the next room, not turning toward the music, not going to her, simply stopping what he was doing for a few minutes and being still in the way that a person is still when they are attending to something that does not admit of a response. Was it affection? Was it the particular sadness of a man in a functional marriage, listening to something beautiful and feeling the distance between the beauty and the feeling that would have made the beauty meaningful in the way he needed it to be? Was it simply exhaustion? A tired man pausing in his work because the sound gave him a reason to? The lady-in-waiting did not say. She recorded what she saw, and then she moved to the next observation, and the evening continued, and Napoleon picked up his dispatch and Marie-Louise played her music, and the baby who would become the king of Rome was not yet born, and the empire was still intact, and the morning was still several hours away. The marriage lasted 4 years in any meaningful sense, from 1810 to 1814, when the Allied powers separated them, and the separation became permanent. 4 years of the particular intimacy that proximity produces, even when proximity is the result of assignment rather than choice. 4 years of a child who was real. 4 years of evenings in the Tuileries when Napoleon worked through his dispatches and Marie-Louise played piano in the next room, and the man at the desk occasionally stopped and listened and did not turn toward the music. Napoleon Bonaparte and Marie-Louise of Austria were married for 4 years in any meaningful sense. They had a son who died young. They never saw each other after 1814. They had been given to each other by the logic of empire and had made of that giving something that was real, if not what either of them might have freely chosen. That is the true story of the marriage, not love, not its absence. The unnamed thing that forms in the space between the two, when the people involved are human enough to let it form.